Welcome to the Falling Walls Plenary Table. Future of Work and Urban Planning.
Good afternoon to all of you in the room. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon to all of you who are joining us remotely. I am Magdalena Skipper. I'm Editor-in-Chief of Nature, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this Falling Walls Circle session on the future of work and urban planning. In case this is the first circle session you're attending, let me just remind you what to expect. So the circle is a place where global leaders in research, in business, in policy and media come together to exchange ideas, discuss solutions to today's biggest problems in science and society. The format will be a discussion panel, which I will lead, and I will be joined by expert panelists who will join me on stage shortly. And there will also be some work for you to do, you here in the room and for all of you online, because of course there is ample time at the end of the discussion for your questions. So our topic today is something that's on everyone's mind, especially today, since the pandemic has deeply changed the way in which we live and work. What is the future of work and urban planning? We're going to be talking about designing, innovating new interventions. So, percentage of the world's population that lives in urban areas is growing. Over the past 60 years, the number of those who live in urban areas has grown fourfold. And of course, the number of countries that are urbanizing is growing. How we live and how we work is changing rapidly. And so to discuss all of this, I have some outstanding panelists with me. So first, I'd like to invite Professor Jutta Allmendinger, who's president of Berlin Social Science Center. Next, I'd like to invite Doris Kleinlein, editorial director at Jovis. Next, I'd like to invite Klaus Lohenhardt, who's head of Institute at Graz University of Technology. And while we're all enjoying being here physically together, we actually have one panelist who is joining us remotely. And so please welcome Edgar Pieterse, Director of African Center for Cities, who's joining us on the screen there. So the physical transition to the table. Now I can actually see you, Edgar. Hello, welcome. So let me start in the convention that the other circle discussion started. You, of course, all had some homework to do. You were asked to reflect on the following question. Could you sketch one specific intervention regarding places of work which you'd like to see within the next 10 years? I'm going to start with you, Doris.
Yeah, I'm going to give you a short input to co-working. Co-working was once a groundbreaking idea for the future of collective work. Co-working spaces developed into an international business model dominated by big firms like WeWork that offer like 700 sites in 120 cities. So I think with the rise of home office through the pandemic, it's time to reappropriate this concept. As a third place between a kitchen table and company office, co-working spaces should become an important place to connect and stabilize neighborhoods. To achieve this, these spaces should not only be offered in city centers, but also in housing areas, in suburban areas, and also in rural areas, where they could be combined with other social functions. And I think this development is taking place already to reappropriate this co-working concept, but it should be promoted and financed much more actively by local authorities, opening it up for groups with low income and no access so far.
Thank you. That's a very, very interesting idea of actually bringing these co-working spaces, but spatially distributed, not just focusing them in specific, perhaps obvious places. Jutta, what is your suggestion?
Thank you. This is very close, actually, to what I thought, because this in Germany, there's this discussion of either working at the office or working at home, but not thinking about the consequences of it, not thinking about what's going to happen to a society. And I'm a sociologist. When everybody sits at home without communicating to others, and not just to the close cooperators, but also to people whom you usually see while traveling to work, while sitting in a tram or whatever. I mean, all this got lost, and we were unable to visit restaurants and things like this, so we actually lost the contact to broader society, actually. We sort of probably strengthened our contact to our very, 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 very close neighborhood, but nothing like this. So I think what we have to discuss today, and this would be my hope, is how to construct cities where people come together from different areas, socially included, in many sort of dimensions of social inclusion, and how this can happen in front of the doors and in the interconnection of different neighborhoods as well.
Thank you, very interesting. And while I'm listening to your answers, I keep thinking that even in posing this question, reimagining the future of work, I bet every one of us is imagining a slightly different definition of work. And of course, our answers, how we reimagine that setting, is going to also depend on what it is that we keep in mind, what it is that we're thinking. So with this, Edgar, I want to turn to you. What is your contribution to this vision in the next 10 years?
Thank you, Magdalena. It's really wonderful to be here in this disembodied, strange apparition. And I'm grateful that I have an opportunity to be part of the conversation. I guess my starting point is really the predominance of informal work in most sub-Saharan African cities. This is the urban context that I'm most familiar with and that I study. And to sort of put this in context, 70% of the labor force is actually in the informal sector. And what we anticipate with a dramatic change in the demographic structure of most African countries is that in just the next 30 years, this labor force will treble. And this is in a context where we've had very, very timid formal employment growth. So what we can anticipate is that informal employment will be the predominant condition of work as it is today, also within the next 10, 20, 30 years' time. And what this means is that, to answer your question directly, is that our imaginary of where people work is very different in this context. In fact, people are already in their neighborhoods, on the streets, occupying public spaces, infesting transport hubs, because that's where the footfall is. And of course, most of these jobs are related to trade and to petty commodity exchange. And so what we really need is good urban design, digital enablement, and figure out how do we insinuate more of nature into these everyday settings, because this is what I believe will enhance both the quality and the productivity of places of work, but also guarantee a form of safety. And I'd like us to incorporate this issue of safety. It might be something as seen as, sort of passé in industrialized context, but it's certainly a major question in the cities that I have as a reference point. Thank you.
Thank you. Very interesting. In many ways, what you just finished on, I think, is going to be a perfect segue to what Klaus will share with us. But before I pass on to Klaus, can I just follow up with a question to you. Considering what you said, to you, Edgar, considering what you said about that distributed, much less formal way of working, is it possible that, for example, your experience of sub-Saharan African setting, it's in fact a model towards which we are moving now, less formal, much more distributed, less rigid? So are we actually undergoing more change, moving towards that state?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the issue, right? Co-working is the norm for us. It's not something that is an imagined future, because the boundaries between private and public and commercial space are almost always collapsed in most of these environments. And not as something that is an ideal, but it is merely the de facto situation because of a lack of infrastructure and opportunities to separate out some of these functions. So absolutely, I think there's something about how we are thinking about intervening in those spaces to bring a better quality of safety, of conviviality, of, if you will, a quality of the public atmosphere, how to do that in a context of very limited resources, and making sure that those who use these spaces, that their livelihoods are not undermined. I think those debates are absolutely translatable. And I think this is part of why this forum is so useful, is because we can think of some of these questions in both directions.
Thank you. So Klaus, tell us about your idea.
So first of all, I'm really happy to be here with you all. In this very special time. And, you know, of course, as all of us, we have been reflecting extensively about our current situation and what that means for human habitation on the planet, which of course includes work. But, you know, as we have been, you know, experiencing, all of us, you know, working and living is almost indistinguishable, you know, in between, you know, those times where we have to recede to our own homes for work. So I would like to take up actually what Edgar proposed, you know, that, you know, there is a much larger need for connecting to the natural sphere, as we have been experiencing that before. There's a real urge. And I would like to actually take you and plant a seed here at Falling Walls for a societal mind shift. A societal mind shift towards a different kind of city, which is a living biome. City as living biomes, as living entities. When Edgar talks about, you know, bringing nature into the city, it's almost like shifting it around and saying, well, we live in the natural, vibrant world. Imagine living systems of people, space, and ecosystem performance. So this may seem obviously as relevant, but in the pandemic, in the last 18 months, we got a really interesting lesson, which is from air and atmosphere. Air and atmosphere is the carrier of all information on the planet, and in some way it connected us. You know, within a few weeks, all of us, all life connected by the medium of air and atmosphere. And so that brought us looking closer into what that actually means, air as a medium. And once we understand that in Western metaphysics, the definition of essence, of things having a soul, everything like that, following Heidegger, is related to objects, completely missing out the in-between. We shouldn't be surprised that we are surprised by a pandemic, because we don't have a concept, we don't have the language, we don't have really the thinking for understanding this connecting, vibrant sphere of atmosphere.
Very interesting. A philosophy dimension. I think it might be the first during these particular discussions here. But let me just probe what you described right now a little bit further. When I think about an urban space, most of the time I don't think about other life that co-inhabits that space with me. But of course, I'm aware of the fact that it exists there. So what you're proposing is a shift in attitude, or you're proposing an actual physical redesign of spaces to maybe accentuate further or amplify those other aspects of a city?
Well, with a shift in our mindsets, of course, action follows. And so what you say is absolutely right. I mean, we discovered in the last 18 months, we actually live with other beings in a much more closer relationship that we ever imagined or even were aware of. And I'm not only talking about, microbes, but also, information that is, kind of deploying across the atmosphere, which is temperature, which is climate, which is minerals, the minerals that are present in the Amazon come from the Sahara, through this vast network of atmospheric movement. And so this medium of atmosphere suggests that we imagine cities cohabiting with all life, and also atmosphere and climate. And so there are vast possibilities to reconceptualize our cities for the benefit of social public health, but also for understanding how we cool cities, for instance. Mm-hmm. Everything not only has its world, but also everything performs. So when we think about nature, about plants, for instance, we could imagine and understand that their performance, their life, their aliveness connects us through atmosphere to their properties. And so bringing nature into the city is something that has vast possibilities in reconceptualizing our existence on the planet.
Thank you. So as we rethink our urban spaces in the context of being more inclusive, I want to turn to both of you, actually. And I know that you have devoted at least part of your research, of your work, I believe, to the importance of migration in the urban context, and you, in the context of work, looking at representation of women and specifically addressing their needs. So I want to ask the question of both of you. Are we beginning to think about cities and redefine them, and actually how the work leisure time dynamic within these urban spaces unfolds, taking into consideration migration, often migration not just from adjacent urban areas but from elsewhere, but also what's the gender dimension to that? Whichever.
Well,
go ahead.
It's not just the gender dimension. I mean, when I think about the issues you raise, and also the question you raised at the very beginning, what we really mean when we talk about work, then of course inequality comes in. So we talk as if everybody would have the possibility to work at home, which is not the case. I mean, we are talking about 40% at the maximum who have this possibility. All others have to travel, and in part widely, to come to their work and work there. And this is not equally distributed. It's highly diversified by education and by type of work, obviously. So we have new ruptures in our world of work, and we have to take this much more seriously than we do before, and because it's new in a way. And the other thing is that working at home is not the same for all people working at home, in particular mothers, and we have very good data from the United States, from the UK, from other countries, means that women have to do much more at the same time. So they have to watch for kids, they have to do their household, they have to do paid work, and this has to come much more on the table. And then addressing you, it also means that air is not distributed equally, or nature is not distributed equally in more and more segregated cities, which we see. And this is a true challenge. So bringing inequality between families, between those people who are allowed to work at home or have to work at home. I do not want to have a normative clash on that, and then the entirely unequal distribution of options in a city, within cities. And those options are more and more distributed unequally. And this was enforced by the pandemic and not the opposite.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. I can totally relate to all three of you, actually, because what I experience, or what we all experience at the moment, is that there's hope for a shift in city planning. Like in the post-war area, we used to plan cities by master plan and separated functions, and then reconnected them by car. And since a few decades, we come back to the mixed city. I think this is absolutely crucial, that we have mixed neighborhoods in terms of income, but also in terms of uses, of functions. There's again the theme of the productive city, that we should produce also within the city and not outside the city. And what I find interesting is we talk a lot about concepts like the 15-minute city at the moment. I think a lot of you are familiar with it, this Paris mayor, Anne Hidalgo. She is currently restructuring the whole of Paris to become a 15-minute city, which means that everything you need should be in reach within 15 minutes. And also, there are other approaches that, like the city on eye level, that is currently being planned in Copenhagen. And what I find really interesting about these concepts, they are not new. Like everything that they contain has been set in the Leipzig Charta, for example, like the German policy paper on this mixed-use city. But I think we are finally putting the individual in the center. Like if I say the 15-minute city, it's the individual that needs to reach what it needs. And also the city on eye level at least starts from the individual. And I think this is a crucial approach also for the non-European perspective. Like if like 80% of people work in informal work relationships, it's very important to see what these specific individuals need. Let's say a co-working space is probably something totally different in Cape Town than here.
When you were talking about the 15-minute city, I was, of course, reminded, so I live in London, which is often described as a collection of villages. And certainly during the pandemic, my village became very familiar to me, much more so than any other time. Edgar, I want to come back to you, because I know in the past you have contested this notion that some of us have, that there is that separation between the city and what's outside of the city. So let's say the city and the village and outside of it. And I know you like to focus on the connection there rather than the distinction. And also what Doris just said reminded me about the producing city, something that often we think production happens outside of the city and it's somehow supplied to the city. Can you talk about that? Is that evolving? Are we reimagining that?
Yeah, thanks. Absolutely, it is evolving. I think that, well, to come back to this question of planning, to just pick up on Doris's point, planning, of course, assumes that you've got contained boundaries and that in some ways you've got a measure of control over what sits within the boundary. And I think what has become much clearer, and certainly given the understanding that we now have about atmospheric flows or other metabolic systems that anchor life, is that this is maybe artificial. And are there ways in which we can think of multiple layers of planning? So, because what we know is that the master planning of old, of course, is obsolete. But if we retreat down to the very local, to the precinct level or to the neighborhood level, then of course we're giving up the possibility of controlling what is happening at regional scales. And what we know is that the city region is the primary scale at which ecosystem services need to be coordinated, regulated, and so forth. But also we know that the global network of city regions accounts for up to 65% of global GDP. And so the urban question, or the urban-rural continuum within city regions, is not just something that can be planned at a local level, because a city region like Cape Town, or Mombasa for that case, is in fact highly dependent on decisions that are made in Shanghai, or in Tokyo, or in London. And so how do we think about planning in that context? So we have to understand this fundamental interdependency between different levels. And we almost need if you will, a stack of different planning systems. And here, what is different and what might enable this, of course, is new digital possibilities, is artificial intelligence, is the possibility of radical openness of data, so that it's not public authorities or private bodies like corporations who do the planning, but these are processes that is open to deliberation by citizens, social movements, the public sector, and private players. So to answer your question finally more directly is that, yes, we have to recognize that there is, in this current moment, whether it's logistics constraints and so forth, the recognition that we've got to understand the relationship between cities and their hinterlands, but we also need to understand a number of other relationships.
Thank you. So this concept of local planning in a global context, we're obviously talking here about reimagining cities, urban environments and work, but of course that framing of the issue is so important in many other contexts. I think many others that were discussed here. And Edgar, without knowing it, you answered my next question, and that is, you mentioned citizens, because of course what I would like to pose this question to all of you at the table. From your perspective, we're talking about redesigning, reimagining, but who are we doing this for? And in fact, who is doing it? Do we have the right redesigners, if you like? Do we have the right actors at the table? Who would like to take this first?
Well, at this table, we most certainly have them in a way, but the question is whether we have them in a reality. And, well, what you call your little villages, in Berlin it's called Kieze, and what is clearly realized and what we know by hard empirical evidence is that social closure of those Kieze increased. And I did not see much intention to bring the neighborhoods of different Kiezes together. This means that people know each other worse and worse, which is of course not good for trust, and you need trust for keeping a society together, as we all know. And in particular, in the very moment if diversity increases, you need people exchanging much more often, coming from those different villages or neighborhoods or towns or rural areas. And so we have to spend much more, not just thoughts, but also action and social planning on it.
Thank you. Any other reflections about who decides how we reimagine and for whom?
Well, what an important question, right? I mean, because, I, as a designer, as an architect, as a landscape architect, I'm not the only person that is going to live in such a neighborhood eventually. So it's always the question, right, how can we, properly integrate all voices? And again, I would like to extend the voices to the more than human, first of all. I mean, this is the week of COP26, so we are not only talking humans. I think this is super important. And I think this could be an amazing opportunity to also reassess who we are, where we are in this amazing global planetary system of life. So, we are currently working on a study funded by the World Bank in Brazil on a permaculture food forest habitation. So people live in a forest that we first think a permaculture food forest, where people live and thrive on the food, establish microeconomic systems through harvesting and processing those plants. So there's ecology, there's life, there's a social dimension, there's habitation for low income, that all can be thought together, which means there's this an amazing group of people, and also those who represent the non-human people. And so these new systems really need to be built and structured and set into process.
But this also implies that we have to rethink ownership.
Yes.
Right, and responsibility and accountability and all the other things that come with it. Sorry, Doris, go ahead.
No, please.
No, I'm done.
No, I heard the word ownership and I raised my voice because this is actually also something really important in city planning, because the last decades, a lot of cities, they sold out their common goods. They sold out public housing, they sold out sites and ground. And I think to really get a hold on housing shortage, on these rising prices that we experience everywhere, we really need to readdress how cities deal with their own ground. And we can't build cheap or affordable housing on expensive grounds. Yeah? And so we need another kind of economy that cities keep what they have, and they decide not only who pays most, who can build on it. So I think this is really crucial. And also you're bringing in a totally different perspective, like saying, how is our relation to nature? Yeah? How can we live with nature and not against it? So this is really interesting, I think, because it also opens up a lot of possibilities for maybe sites or grounds that we don't build on at the moment, and we don't want to build so much anymore. So we have to think about another kind of architecture also.
Yes, it basically means bringing nature in and kicking cars out.
Yeah. Let me bring
this would
Edgar.
then provide space. Nature also needs space if you bring it in. And during the pandemic, you actually saw it in many Berlin streets, that the streets were occupied by the inhabitants, and they opened it up for bicycle and traffic, but not for cars. And you can't imagine how much square meters they win. And they could use it for a table, they could walk outside, they were visible. And if you then would use this closer inner network or inner neighborhood ties, to bring the broader ties, the bigger ties in, then you could do a lot with this concept. So it's neighborhood, which then will be enforced, I think, by much more diversity than we have by now. And one possibility or one feeder to this could be more nature within the cities and less individualized traffic, because nature brings people together and traffic sets people apart.
Some really interesting concepts being brought in, and one thing I have at the back of my mind, which we may get to talk about, of course, is transport, which in really mega cities really important.
Crucial.
If we're going to move in and live in much smaller spaces, that may certainly, in terms of funding, have implications for this. But I wanted to bring in Edgar to comment on that as well.
Yeah, we've sort of...
He's here, he's with us.
No, you see him, but he's so close to me that I'm sorry, Edgar, don't take it personally.
No problem. I'll try not breathe into your neck. So I wanted to say one of the debates we are grappling with is precisely to come to terms with just the scale of the forms of citizenship that we're talking about in this context, and the possibility of really understanding this as an educational intervention at a societal scale. So if we imagine the new skills that's required, the citizens to be deeply involved in the reimagining and the rebuilding of their neighborhoods and cities, it implies a kind of design literacy, budgetary literacy, ecological intelligence, understanding how planning and administrative systems work, but all of this combined with forms of civic AI that can represent the interests of non-human actors. That is an important part of the calculus that has to be arrived at. And if we think of it at that scale, and you kind of imagine we broaden basic education, higher education, early childhood development to incorporate societal learning through civic academies of some sort or the other, then we're beginning to approximate what would be involved institutionally to build this new form of citizenship. And to remember here, the promise is that we can get to a level of citizen control and collective organization in relation to the commons that has been unprecedented in the 20th century. But this is the only governance response that can live up to the complexity of the challenges we're talking about. And so I think for me, this is the cross-continental conversation we need to have is how do we imagine institutionalizing this and how do we resource this? And what's the substance of this new form of learning and pedagogy?
Fantastic. Thank you very much. I had another question for all of you, but I'm not going to ask it because now it's time for others to ask their questions. If it doesn't come up, maybe I'll seed it. But over to you, please.
Well, let's first open to the floor as well as our digital audience, but please raise your hand if you have a question, and I'm sure we have quite a few on this very broad topic. Yeah, and microphone will be arriving in just 1 second. And I'll remind our audience to keep their answers short so we can get in as many as possible.
Hello, everybody. My name is Jochen Sandig. I'm co-founder of that beautiful place, Radial System, which is a transformed pumping station. And what I just want to bring back to you is that what is happening now, in this very moment, with this very red dot, with this agora that we are celebrating here, is a role model that can be transported to other cities. Why not spaces, transform public spaces, transform city dialogues, town hall meetings happen on a regular basis in all kinds of cities. What is happening here now? I think what you're discussing is already the solution. You're practicing it. And I think the number of 4 people, or in that case 5 people, sitting together, and now let's imagine that people could join the conversation, people would leave, so you have an ongoing participation possibilities of different rooted backgrounds of each city. That should happen on a regular basis, not once in a while, like Falling Walls is a very exclusive and also inclusive thing. So what do you think about that, transporting the idea of regular-based town hall meetings, please?
Yes, thank you very much. I'm not entirely agreeing with you because this table is highly educated, not socially diverse. We would then, of course, need to have younger people, older people, as this is hard, I mean, I'm pretty old, but people coming from, in particular, different social and ethical backgrounds. This is very much important. And then we would make, then we see that there have been, has been some progress made with democratic parties, in particular in Germany, when they opened it up to public discourses, and we also need it on a European level, of course, as well. Yeah, it would be the first step, and therefore we need, I don't know the English term, but there is this thing which failed in our last governments is Demokratieförderungsgesetz because it also applies a lot to democratic forms in learning democracy in the neighborhood and with your neighbors and above your neighbors.
But you know, the last thing I think that Edgar talked about in some way could be a form of addressing the question we just heard now. You were talking about inventing new institutional formats that could at once educate and embrace and bring citizens into the conversation, into their virtual table. Go ahead, please.
Thanks. Yeah, it's very hard to work out how do I get into the conversation. Thanks. No, just a very small point to respond to that really useful contribution from the floor. That in our experience, it is really important to connect the possibility of deliberation in these open forums with making a commitment or an investment to solving the issue at stake, right? Because otherwise you end up having men, articulate people, middle-class people, etc., all of those who are privileged in one form or another, dominating the discourse and often using very politically correct and inclusive discourse. But in fact, the underlying power relations within a community or an association or whatever the issue might be is not addressed because there isn't a connection between voice and taking responsibility and being accountable. And so when we also therefore need to think about how does one if you will, dynamize these deliberative forums with deeper and stronger accountability.
Which will then also increase respect in others and learn how other people think, which is highly needed as well.
Great. Do we have any other questions?
Yes, we've got a question from the online audience. Where are the innovative systems for cycling and other forms of perhaps more sustainable mobility in our cities?
We come to transport after all. Who would like to comment?
The question was where this takes place, or?
The question is, I suppose, what are the pathways to getting to a more sustainable transport system in our cities?
Yeah, I mean, as Dr. Eimendinger said, of course, we need to divide traffic space fairly, because at the moment it's very dominated by the car. And this is something this could be done actually this is a low-hanging fruit actually, yeah? It doesn't...
In towns,
yeah.
Not in rural areas.
And in terms of design, because we also talk about design and planning today, we do have a lot of approaches and best practice examples, yeah? Like I think of the Netherlands, where they built parking garage for bikes for 12,000 bikes, where you can drive and like you did before with a car into a parking garage. So we really have to rethink what's also comfortable for another kind of mobility, but we also, of course, we have to think not about the inner city only. We really have to bring infrastructure, these transport hubs, everything that more or less, if you live in the inner city, you got the 15-minute city and you got a quite comfortable way of moving around. We need to bring it to the suburbs, and we also need to think what mobility in rural area means, because this is totally different question.
Yes, absolutely. And of course, a lot of the conversation that happens here outside of this session is rooted in science, and often science unfolds in very specific places, which may not be necessarily 15 minutes away, as well as this is just one example. So we must remember about that transport, which of course has to be sustainable, has to be green, and has to be affordable as well.
Yeah. And another aspect which of course, it's the most important one probably in these times, is without bringing public transfer to the suburbs and to rural areas, you can't expect from people to engage in climate change. I mean, they simply have to have the opportunity to engage, and they don't have it right now. I mean,
let's see if we can take one other question from the floor. We have a question here.
My question is about autonomous driving. How do you see the impact of autonomous driving for urban planning, also for suburbs and other areas coming? And when do you see this coming? 5 years, 10 years, 15 years?
Autonomous driving. We're still staying with transport.
Well, I mean, if you take autonomous driving as a substitute of buses or trains who then autonomously drive, then of course, I mean, this is something I could follow, but individual autonomous driving, if you want to put it like this, doesn't make any sense because it doesn't substitute cars for cars. But in case of collecting people and therefore decreasing the number of cars on streets and decreasing parking spaces needed in the city or in the moment used for city, then of course it could be a concept. But
so if I may, we are running...
He really disagreed with my answer, so he should probably continue talking.
Well, we are running out of time, but I do invite both of you to carry the conversation on afterwards. I mean, however, I am going to usurp my privileged position and ask the question which we have not discussed yet and nobody has come up with, and that is the question of mental health. We have suffered, of course, in the lockdowns, in many situations. Some have actually prospered in that setting, others have suffered from it, but the equation has definitely changed. Are we redesigning, are we reimagining work and urban spaces with that in mind? You only have 30 seconds to answer that.
Wow, big question. No, I think we need to meet again. We need this personal contact, absolutely, because this we all know that this video conference that is endless and endless does make us ill. And yeah, I think mental health also is very close connected to physical health. I need to be able to move. I need to have access to good food, also in suburban areas, and yeah, I think it's that whole package that we need to be able to live in that circumstance.
Jutta?
Well, isolation is negatively correlated with mental health. This is what we know, and therefore we have to bring people together, diverse people, and so this question is actually not hard.
Edgar?
Absolutely critical, and the disturbing issue in a context like South Africa, where we've got extremely high levels of gendered violence, is that we saw a spike in cases of domestic abuse. And so absolutely, this has to be front and center of any conversation about well-being.
Thank you. Klaus?
Well, again, the big picture is, the decline of species on the planet, can be directly linked to the decrease of diversity in our gut microbiome, which is responsible for mental health, right? Which is responsible for our immune system. So the big picture, right, relating to the planetary diversity also gives answers to how we should deal with our mental health.
Thank you. Thank you, all of you, for amazing contributions. We come away with a much richer sense of how we have to reimagine and redesign work and urban environments, which of course are connected, how we have to be much more inclusive and much more diverse in the way we think, going beyond human species. And very interestingly, there is that global and local tension, as well as the tension or rather connection between the individual and institution, and that accountability and following from words and discourse through to accountability and implementation. Thank you very much.
Thank you for getting us together.